All right, it looks like we're right about time, so we'll go ahead and get started. So I'd like to welcome you to our What is Data workshop. So if we can have the next slide, we'll kind of go through the agenda and give folks some time to kind of settle in. But we'll walk through what we're going to do today and then follow up with some, at the end, some activities that we'll have going on as well too. But for today, what we're looking at is we're going to start off with the introduction of our LRCE Study of STEM Intervention Center, otherwise known as SOSI. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and we'll talk a little bit about kind of what sparked the creation of the center and what the center is up to in terms of activities that can support you throughout your journeys of developing and writing for different programs and reporting and all of that. Today, the goal of the program, though, will be to really kind of focus on some areas around data and really thinking about data and what constitutes data as we look at really thinking about ways to tell the story around impact and all of that regarding your program. So today we're going to start off with a very kind of practical way of doing that. We're going to look at a case study and have some discussion around that. And with that, we're going to identify, like I said, what are data sources? What are things that we can do within our STEM programmings and really kind of think about, again, how to think about reporting that overall outcomes and impacts from what we may traditionally think about data. We're also going to look at resources for collecting data and resources and outlets for disseminating that data. Then we're going to move into a Q&A session. And then, as I mentioned, we'll talk about our next webinar, as well as some other things that we've got going on within the SOSI Center. Next slide, please. So to get us started, our Lewis Stokes Regional Center of Excellence for the study of STEM intervention, again, as SOSI, we kind of developed this to be able to cultivate the cultural awareness and scholarly productivity of future and existing program leaders. And so with that, we wanted to take kind of a three-pronged approach to be able to do that. And our first prong is really thinking about the implementation of different frameworks that we can utilize, particularly as we think about cultivating awareness, cultural awareness. So what are the frameworks that we can utilize to really help support that as we're building out programs, as we're building out interventions? And we want to take a guided, critical identity focus and social cognitive theoretical framework. If you join us for, as I mentioned, we'll talk a little bit about some activities that we'll have, but if you join us for our Summer Institute, we talk a lot about three specific frameworks that we like to utilize within the SOSI Center. Also, we'll talk about some methods and measures to inform practice. And that's kind of going to be more the focus of what we're doing with our webinar series that we're now introducing. And then from there, we're going to really work on how do you utilize this to develop scholarship and to disseminate, again, those outcomes and impacts of programs. So just to give it a little bit about who we are again and our partnerships and all of that, the SOSI Center is made up of the University of Missouri, a nonprofit organization called Understanding Interventions, and you'll hear more about that, and the Diversity Research and Policy Program at the University of Michigan. So those are our three key partners that we utilize for the SOSI Center. And specifically, the folks that are involved in the center in itself is, as we see our pictures there, those will be folks that you'll be seeing on the screen today, is our research assistant and project coordinator. We call him Al DeBrey. And myself, as I mentioned, I'm Natasha Davis, and I serve as the principal investigator for the SOSI Center. Anthony DePaz, who is one of our co-directors, Natalie Downer, who serves as a co-PI, Angela Ebrio, who serves as a resource specialist, Michael Garcia is our program director, Terrell Morton is our co-PI and curriculum coordinator, and then Shantae Outlaw, who serves as a resource specialist as well. So some of the activities that we have going on, as I mentioned, SOSI is definitely kind of the integration of these three-pronged approaches that we use. And one of the ways that we kind of converge all of that together is through our signature program that we have called our Summer Institute. And this is a 3-day platform that we utilize to be able to provide professional development as we implement a lot of those strength-based frameworks that we talked about, we implement things around research and methodologies, and we talk about ways of dissemination. So again, the SOSI Center Summer Institute is a great platform to begin to bring that all together and really kind of develop this idea of converging those three prongs that we talked about. We also give virtual presentations for requests for small groups. And as I mentioned, we're introducing now, this is our very first Lunch and Learn webinar series that we have, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then we also have resources to be able to make available through the UI organization. They have the Understanding Interventions Index. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along in the presentation, as well as we talked about ways of disseminating and publishing and all of that. And one of the partners that we have within the UI is the Understanding Intervention Journal. So today, as I mentioned, this is the kickoff of our Lunch and Learn webinar series. And the purpose of the series in itself is really to help operationalize critical strength-based frameworks in dissemination efforts of speaking about outcomes across all audiences. Okay, so we really want to keep that purpose in mind. The goal of the Lunch and Learn series is really to provide you with the resources and materials, platforms that you need to really think about ways to kind of work on the advancing of the work that you're doing, really writing and disseminating those efforts and getting those out there. And so we really want to concentrate on that with our seminar series that we have. So our first one today is identifying data. We're going to dig into that. Again, what is data? What can you utilize? What constitutes it? Our next one, and we'll talk a little bit more about this at the end as we wrap up, will be around theory, integration, and storytelling. And then finally, we'll look at data analysis and writing. And we're going to use this our webinar series, to serve as the platform to really start to think about all these things as we go into our Summer Institute. So if you join us for the webinar series, you're already in good shape to really think about all of these things and make them into very practical, actualized methods as we move into the SOSI Summer Institute. So with that, we'll get started with our Identifying Data series, and I will turn it over to Dr. Ebriel.
Dr. April, you're muted.
Okay, sorry, let me repeat that. Sorry about being muted. So it's my role to introduce the case study to you today. The goal of this particular webinar is to support you with identifying sources of data that exist by presenting a case study that is an actual STEM broadening participation program, and we'll be demonstrating how these data can be used in various dissemination efforts. So the structure of this webinar is to share details about the case. We'll be polling you to see what types of data you that stand out to you. And then we'll be outlining sources of data that are noted by us. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've labeled this program Step Up. So Step Up, it was an actual program that was funded by the National Science Foundation under the STEM Talent Expansion Program, which has been discontinued, currently discontinued. It was funded for 5 years, and it was conducted at a 4-year urban university. This particular university was located in a very multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial urban area. It was successful in enrolling undergraduates in STEM disciplines, but the attrition rates after the first year was very high. And so the persons who wrote the grant for Step Up wanted to address this loss of talent by creating a coordinated, mutually reinforcing set of activities that would transform the first-year STEM experience for historically excluded students. Next slide, please. So the goal of Step Up was to address retention beyond the first year of enrollment. The program used 4 different strategies to achieve this goal. The first one was to create a learning community for first-year students interested in STEM, to increase the quality and the relevance of STEM instruction through a community of practice, to strengthen various support units that support STEM students, to strengthen learning centers, and to foster collaboration between these different units, and to build institutional capacity to capture, track, and report on the academic trajectories of STEM students. Next slide, please. So the participants, well, let me back up a minute. So the program used a cohort model. That is, each year of the 5 years of funding, a new cohort of first-year students entered the program. And all of the first-year students indicated that they were interested in majoring in STEM. So there are several components to the program. There's a summer component, a fall component, and the academic tutoring and other aspects of it. So I'd like to give you a more detailed description of these components than what is available on the slide. So first, the summer component. So the summer component consisted of a 5-year residential program in which students met 4 days a week. It consisted of a math enrichment course, a chemistry lab that was a structured research experience, and a summer seminar. So the summer seminar was taught once a week by the STEM advisor, and it focused on academic advising, orientation to campus resources, and discussions related to STEM opportunities at the university, and also information about STEM careers. The fall component was structured to help students persist in STEM to their graduation through academic advising and tutoring, a clustered course registration, a fall seminar, and the freshman research experience. So in the clustered course registration, community was built by having the students in the program enroll in the same sections of the different STEM courses that they were enrolled in. So they would be attending courses with persons, other persons who were in the program, and they would have other peers to interact with during their first year. There was also a physical space in which that was designated to the students so that they would be able to access computers and be able to study with other members of their cohort. The academic advising, study groups, and tutoring was set up so that students it was required for them to meet with their academic advisor at least 2 times a semester. And tutoring by graduate students was available throughout the academic year. The program also used what I'll label as intrusive advising, so that if it was indicated during midterms that students were in trouble in their courses, an advisor would immediately meet with them to discuss their course performance. And then lastly, during the second semester of their first year, the students were introduced to research through an undergraduate research experience. Next slide, please. All right. With all NSF grants, the criteria for addressing whether or not the program overall has met its objectives, there are 2 criteria that NSF uses. One is intellectual merit, and the other is broader impacts. So the grant leadership developed and utilized a model that basically consisted of a team. And this model incorporated best practices, national best practices for recruiting and retaining students. So this leadership team consisted of the 2 program directors, the first director was a faculty member in chemistry, and this person was responsible for developing the laboratory experiences and the summer academic experience. Then the second faculty grant co-director was responsible basically for the advising and the overall implementation of the program. And then the other staff member that was associated with the program was an academic advisor. And this person was met with the students over the course of their academic careers, even past the first year that they're in the program. The second NSF criteria is broader impacts. So this involved ensuring that the program resulted in improved retention and graduation rates for women in STEM and for the historically marginalized students. Currently, and at the time that the evaluation was actually completed on this program, the program graduates were contributing their perspectives and their talents to the local, regional, and national STEM workforce, and many of them had applied to graduate school. So the model, and also in terms of its broader impact on society, the leaders of the program disseminated their efforts to other comparable urban research institutions. Next slide. I'll turn this over now to Terrell Morton.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ebrio. So to engage you all in this presentation, having shared a little information about the case, we want to kind of get a sense of where you are in terms of thinking about the types of data that could come from this experience. And so what I'm going to do in the chat is drop 2 links. I'm going to drop a link to the actual case study that Dr. Ebrio just shared, and you should be able to click on it and access it and review all of that information in terms of the program overview, goals, descriptions, outcomes. That's all the information we're sharing. And based on that information, in this second link, which is a Jamboard, we want to see how you are thinking about data that can come from these broadening participation programs. And so in going back to the questions, based off of the overview, the 4 strategies and the main goal, the program description and outcomes, what sources of data do you think people could extract from this broadening participation program case study? So I'm going to leave this question up for just a couple of minutes while people are looking, and then I'm actually going to pull up the Jamboard slide for those who may not be familiar with Jamboard so that you can get a chance to see how to work with it. On the Jamboard, you should be able to see this very first page that includes some instructions on how to actually write or add information on the Jamboard. You can add sticky notes. You can type directly into text box by using this icon, or if your penmanship is better than mine, you can write directly onto the Jamboard. And what you're going to do is you're going to click on this icon that says next frame to add information on this slide regarding the types of data that you think could be extracted from this case study. And so I'm reposting the Jamboard link, and I'm reposting the case study link. And I want you to just take a couple minutes. There is no wrong answer. There is no right answer. There is just your answers. Throw some ideas out there in terms of what kind of information, what kind of data, if you were to be trying to demonstrate impact, if you were trying to report outcomes, if you were trying to do some research, just what kind of data do you think would come from this program? All right. Getting some good answers. Number of students participating in the program at the beginning of the bridge program, at the beginning of the fall, and at the end of the semester. So looking at student enrollment across different time points as data sources, number of students in each major as a data source, grades, you can see that as a data source, responses to pre-post surveys for each of the programs. That's a good data source. What other sources of data might we be thinking? Interview responses after completing, so looking at students' perceptions. And it seems like there's some kind of comparison in terms of those who enter in STEM majors versus those who don't enter into the program. So seeing some levels added to this data component. Academic advisors' impressions of problem area students. So seeing some data, not from the students' perspectives, but from other key actors or players in this program. Take about 1 minute and 30 seconds to see what else we can just collectively brainstorm in terms of types of data. Measurement of student STEM interest. And if you're thinking through the strategies, the description, and the outcomes, equity gaps for program participants versus comparison groups in terms of entry into STEM majors and retention. So how are we looking? I think when they're saying equity gaps, we can see conceptions of equity in terms of enrollment. There seems to be conceptions of equity in terms of access and engagement. And when they're talking similar demographics, I'm interpreting that to mean if you're looking within specific subgroups, such as race or gender or first generation status or rural students or students from urban areas and things of that nature. All right. So I appreciate you all for sharing that information. And this Jamboard will still be up if you want to still access it and throw in some last minute thoughts as we're continuing to move through our discussion. But so some of the data sources that were actually noted by the case study team were student data. So there was data collected through interviews of the individual student participants. There was data collected through focus groups of some of the subgroups of participants. There were various internet or web-based surveys that were disseminated to the students. Again, this information really looking at student perception, student awareness, student engagement, student understanding. There was institutional level data that was collected by the case study team, where there was information from enrollment management, such as student enrollment into the program, student enrollment into STEM majors, student enrollment in different courses. looking at grades and GPA, overall GPA versus major GPA, as well as students' declaration of a major. So STEM, representing science, technology, engineering, mathematics, encompasses multiple subdisciplines within those broader areas. So where were the students actually declaring majors and how? And then there was some other potential data that we are somewhat aware of, though we can't give you the specifics of that data based off of the information that was shared with us from this case. And so we do know that the case study team collected data from the specific Step Up program, though we're not entirely sure what data came from the Step Up program. And we also know that the case study team collected data from the faculty and teaching staff, those people who were intimately involved with the classes that were implemented, as well as some of the other professional development activities that the Step Up students participated in. And as we were thinking about data as a SOSI team, recognizing that our leadership comprises individuals with varied backgrounds, some of us having backgrounds in the hard and biomedical sciences, some of us having backgrounds in the educational sciences, some of us having background in the social sciences, and then all of us operating at different levels, from either program administrators to science faculty to evaluators to STEM program directors to social science and educational science researchers, scholars, and faculty. All of these different lenses were coming together as we were discussing the types of data that we saw within the case and how the data could be extracted to disseminate different types of stories. And so when we looked specifically at the same information that you looked at in terms of the program benchmarks and outcomes, the participants, the design of the Step Up program, what we were theorizing was data that could be used for success. And when we talk about success, we're talking specifically about obtaining the established benchmarks of the program. As you're creating a program, as you're writing a grant, there's certain benchmarks and goals that you list to demonstrate that you are keeping up with what you promised. From an evaluation stance, sometimes we talk about that as like feasibility. We also then talked about how data could be used to disseminate impact. And when we talk about impact, we're really emphasizing this idea of why the program should be sustained and how the program attempts to address that sort of root problem or root cause that it was designed to implement. And so data for impact and data for success and benchmarks, if you're paying attention to those two columns, can be very similar data. It's just a matter of how you mix the data to tell a story. And then lastly, recognizing that our broadening participation programs often exist in spaces where you have social science scholars involved in addition to program directors and evaluators. There's always this question of research. How are we disseminating the outcomes of our projects in ways that are advancing the general knowledge, awareness, and understanding of specific phenomena associated with the program? And so if we're studying retention, what kind of knowledge are we advancing on retention? If we're studying enrollment, what kind of knowledge are we advancing on enrollment that could be directly aligned with our program goals, but could also not be aligned with our program goals, but just based off of the data gathered from that program? And so we talked about that kind of data for research sake. And again, if you're looking across these three columns, you'll start to see a lot of overlap between the points of data that we discussed and how the data could be used to tell different stories. And one of the things that we wanted to share in this space is that when you're thinking about data, data can be everywhere. Data can be almost anything, recognizing that there's quantitative data, numbers, statistical analyses, percentages, and there's qualitative data in terms of stories, in terms of written memos and notes, individual reflections and understandings. What matters is how you then draw out that data and then manipulate that data to then disseminate that data. So to think then, to prime you for some ideas around manipulating and disseminating data, the second question that we have for you all is, what types of driving questions do you think you could ask based on the data if you were working as a program staff and you wanted to ensure benchmarks for success, or if you wanted to ensure impact of your program, or if you're working as an evaluator and you're wanting to support the program staff with demonstrating benchmarks for success or demonstrating impact of the program, or if you're working as a researcher and you're helping to support all three, or you're only focusing on the idea of generating knowledge. So thinking about the data that you identified, as well as some of the data that we just shared through our analysis as a SOSI leadership, what type of driving questions do you think could come up based off of these different entry points into the conversation? And so I'm going to go back to the Jamboard now. This is our Jamboard slide on data, and you all have done a great job with that. And now thinking about driving questions. What kind of driving questions may come to mind? And I'm going to set my timer again for just a few minutes so that we can continue to prompt you in this conversation of data and data extraction. And if you need to flip between the two slides, you can. And I will also pull back up the slide that talked about the data that we identified as a team, if you want to reference this slide plus the data that you identified as you're thinking about driving questions. I'll pull the Jamboard back up in about 1 minute. Just want to make sure that you have the opportunity to refer to this particular slide. All right, let's see what we have here. So some of the driving questions that you all are perceiving are, has the program achieved its intended goals? Can definitely see that as a driving question, and can see that as a question that misspelled researcher, my bad. Program staff or evaluator. I was just misspelling everything. Could ask, what major themes were revealed from the interview focus groups? Changes in level of confidence. Okay, so looking at some thematic analysis based off of some of that qualitative data that was extracted. And did we see any changes in student confidence, any changes in their persistence, changes in their views or perceptions? So looking at change could be a driving question, or just understanding benchmarks in terms of how they're perceiving this space could be driving questions. What are change trajectories of participants in their STEM career intentions during undergraduate years? So this seems to be almost mapping sort of the decision-making process of students and what careers they might be pursuing or their interests. And are they shifting along the lines of from when they started to when they graduated? And what other kind of information or resources are informing those decisions? So I think that that's a really good question that could be asked on all three levels. Do students who access career counseling more likely to pursue STEM careers than students who do not access career counseling? So now we're having a very specific question about a very specific intervention. And that could be used across all three levels based off of how we're trying to discuss the importance and impact of career counseling. Which program activities are most related to students' academic performance? Could see that as demonstrating impact as you're hoping to make an argument for sustainability in specific resources and opportunities. How does this program align with the university leadership's goal for DEI recruitment or retention? Another good question if you're thinking about demonstrating impact and the desire to have sustainability, recognizing that if you're looking to institutionalize broadening participation programs, there has to be synergy and convergence across different university or institutional initiatives and or leadership spaces. What impact has this program made on the university's broadening participation mission? Okay, again, demonstrating impact, sustainability goals. Could also see that from a research perspective. If you're asking about the relationship between institutional politics and desires and structures and externally funded programs and how they come together to formulate higher education change. What expectations did students have of the program, and did the program meet those expectations? Very intentional to examine student perceptions, awarenesses, engagements, understandings, and how we're centering student voices to demonstrate success for benchmarks, demonstrate success for impact, and even examining student voices for research. Impact and effectiveness of STEM communities on retention as it pertains to completion of STEM degrees versus students who are not part of the community. Again, very intentional, very specific examination of the program's fidelity and the program's ability to meet its established goals and demonstrate its need to be continually invested in. Lastly, next steps, any room for expansion to include other departments? So I love this question too, because a lot of times when we're engaged in the thick of things with our broadening participation programs, we're usually hyper-focused on what's happening in the moment because we made these promises from our grants, or we have these reports, or we have these different people that we want to communicate impact too. And we're not always thinking about the longer story or the broader vision regarding higher education, transformation, change, sustainability, particularly for people from marginalized groups. And so in always having some kind of vision forward question in mind, you can be collecting data and thinking about how your data is taking you towards that next step, again, as a way to continue this demonstration of impact and the need of sustaining your project and your program. So I really appreciate these questions and these thoughts. You all have been very intentional with this, which is making me excited because there's a lot of overlap. When we as a team were discussing it, Dr. Ebrio was helping us organize our thoughts around the types of questions or the types of driving assumptions that might be leading how we engage within broadening participation programs and data extraction. So there could be questions where program administrators and staff are looking at the specific impact of the model, looking at how it's informing and influencing students' decisions and engagement. Whereas evaluators, and you're thinking about formative and summative assessments, how are or is that model impacting long-term outcomes, institutional change and structure? Whereas a scholar, you're asking critical questions about how are these factors informing decision-making? How are these factors informing choice? How are these factors informing expectations or associated values or the motivation to continue, or even maybe some of the challenges that are impeding students' persistence and the ways that they're navigating those challenges so that we as educational scholars and we as practitioners can be intentional to address those particular barriers in both research and program design. So I'm passing the hat now to future Dr. Shante Outlaw, who's really going to help build from this perspective of thinking about the data and thinking about the driving questions to talk about the resources that exist in this current moment that you can extract or that you can tap into to help you with collecting data from your own programs.
Thank you, Dr. Morton. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Shante Outlaw. I would just like to start by reminding each of you that your story matters. Many times, of course, we get inundated with the work, as practitioners in the space that, dissemination becomes, a want and a desire, but whatever situation, impedes on the ability to get that out, just becomes overwhelming and, it gets pushed to the back burner. But I just want to remind you again that your story matters. You heard Dr. Morton say that there is data in almost everything, especially in the things that you're doing, the things that you're collecting to submit your annual reports for your programs anyways. So just as a reiteration of those sources of data that you can extract from your programs that we've discussed, some acceptable forms are institutional data, student survey data, student assessment data, and of course, faculty, staff, and mentor data that can come from, the institutional repositories or from surveys that you could give to faculty, staff, mentors, etc. Next slide, please. So of course, with that, we understand that there are many sources of data available, not just within your institution or within your programs, but also on a national level as well. So with these available sources, some are public and others, of course, are proprietary. And of course, depending on your study, you may have to use more than one source, as some are limited in their ability to track student progress into and through STEM programs. So for comparison or for additional context, you may have to use more than one source of data. And so with this, the sources that we have identified here, they rely on three main types of data that we've discussed multiple times already. But those three main types, of course, are the institutional level data, which of course we know our institutional research departments are collecting and analyzing. They also, of course, rely on student unit record data. And so again, universities and colleges are collecting this data on individual students for whatever internal administrative purposes, such as registration, enrollment, determination of financial aid, et cetera. All of that counts and all of that matters. And then lastly, surveys of your students, surveys of your faculty. They help to capture aspects of the experiences, the attitudes, the characteristics, et cetera, that are not collected in this standard unit record or institutional level data. And so with that, we have identified a number of available, I started panicking. Go back for me, please. Okay. I just came off of a computer hack. So when I saw the screen, I started panicking. But anyways, we've identified a number of existing data resources. Again, some are national, some are proprietary. So the IPEDS is operated by the National Center of Education Statistics. And this is their core post-secondary education data collection program. So I know that this particular resource is used extensively because it includes information on 12-month enrollment. It includes completion data. It includes graduation rates. It includes outcome measures survey for a number of national institutions. The great thing about this is that every college, university, technical, vocational institution that has a financial aid program or administers financial aid is required under Title IV to provide this data annually. So IPEDS is released 3 times a year, and there's 2 online platforms that actually make this data accessible. So the beginning post-secondary longitudinal study, this one is a lot more richer in terms of data that goes beyond the basic institutional data. And then, of course, if we're looking at financial aid information for the sake of looking at socioeconomic status, et cetera, then the National Student Loan Data System can be used. And then a more proprietary resource is the Higher Education Research Institute surveys. There are 4 different surveys that they conduct. This is, of course, out of the University of California at Los Angeles. And so those 4 surveys are the freshman survey, the first year college, and the college senior survey, the faculty survey, and the diverse learning environment survey. The diverse learning environment survey is one of their newest surveys that they've started to conduct. I think out of all 4, it's the one with the lowest response rate. However, it does aim to give a story of the actual institutional environment from the student perspective in terms of sense of belonging, in terms of the approachfulness, I guess would be the correct word, of the faculty, et cetera. So those are some existing data sources that can be used as comparison to your data at your institution for research purposes. Next slide, please. So when it comes to repositories, sometimes researchers, of course, explore repositories because they not only can access data there, but they can also share their data in these repositories. And so repositories can be used to not just exchange data, but also build a community around the specific area of interest. And so these are 4 different repositories that are available to you, that are easily accessible and that are fairly user-friendly in terms of accessing data and also sharing your data sets. The one, of course, that I would like to highlight is the Open Science Framework, just because I know that there have been a number of colleagues that have begun to use that in most recent years. And so, of course, with the Open Science Framework, it is free to deposit your data. It's also free to access your data. And you can also receive a DOI whenever, your data is placed there. I would also like to highlight the UI index. Next slide, please. Sorry about that. It's a repository in a sense, but a more sophisticated repository. It's also, of course, one of the resources that this LSRCE SOSI Center funds and supports. I was explaining this over the weekend to a group of individuals who had visited our table, and I said it's the PubMed for broadening participation. And so they were like, what do you mean? And so the issue has been, of course, that articles related to broadening participation in STEM or STEM workforce diversity have been found in a number of different journals, but the access to those journals is fairly difficult. And so we as practitioners, or we as basic scientists who, become practitioners, who are not social scientists, who are not trained in, the social science aspects or areas, we may not be familiar with some of those journals that these type of articles are found in. And so with that, UI developed the index, which literally pulls together the sources or the journals or the resources by which these articles or this work is published. And so you heard me go from journals to resources, because you not only find articles in the index, but you also find instruments, and you also find reports, and you also find theses, if those are available, and if, of course, they contain the information that you're looking for when you do the search. Dr. DePass, of course, will discuss in more detail about the Understanding Interventions Index once he presents. But I would just like to say that the new and improved version actually allows a direct download directly from the academic databases using, of course, a sophisticated API. And so with that, there's a lot of different functions that you're able to do. You can cite directly on the platform, you can download, you can share. And then from those functions, you also are able to access specific instruments, as opposed to going through the actual articles and having to read them. So go to the next slide for me, please. Those instruments would be important, of course, in your research for looking at some of those non-cognitive factors and some of those characteristics of students that are not found in your institutional data or your student record data, et cetera. So some of the surveys that are commonly used in the broadening participation research field are your behavioral engagement related to instruction survey, your beliefs about reformed science teaching and learning surveys, your cure surveys if you have a cure at your institution. Next slide, please. And then some of those psychosocial factors that actually matter in determining persistence, in determining student motivation, and also in capturing student thoughts, feelings, and beliefs about, their experiences in STEM. So here you have some resources on instruments that are available that can help you assess your students' academic self-efficacy for STEM, your student social or science identity, their expectancy for a career in STEM, and also their sense of belonging. Next slide. I think we're kicking it to Dr. DePass.
Thank you very much, future Dr. Outlaw. So I'm going to spend a few minutes to talk about disseminating your work. Once you've gone through, you have figured out data and questions that you can ask and data that you can collect, as well as accessing some of the resources that you just saw. And hopefully you've been able then to develop a story as to the efficacy or the impact of your work. The question then is, how do you get it out? Where do you put it? And that can be done for various reasons, right? You could be, number one, disseminating to demonstrate to your own institution. Sometimes we have to do that in terms of what's actually occurring, so that the wheel isn't really reinvented at your institution and for other institutions for that matter. And many times that can occur in very direct, informal settings. You can communicate directly to your colleagues. You can post information in terms of the program and its outcomes on the website. You can do more formal presentations. If there's a faculty forum or something like that, one can do that within your institution, or you can offer to visit institutions that have similar interests, either in terms of programs they're having or interests of the faculty, to give talks. And many times, especially for us with for those with funded programs, we're always looking for volunteers to come and talk about their work. So those are other ways you can do it fairly informally. As you look to take on more formal settings, one can start looking at opportunities in terms of local conferences. So maybe you're putting on a symposium of some sort or a conference of some sort, or it could be that your colleague is doing that. You could offer that, oh yes, we can come and talk about some of the things that we have found in terms of this strategy or this incorporation of this theoretical frame or this type of approach that we have taken, as you saw in the case study. Well, that's a great start. And if one then is looking to move beyond that phase, one can then look to see opportunities where you can present this work and the outcomes of your work and conclusions made from what you've done on a larger stage. And there are different stages and type of stages that one can do this. And I'm just going to go through a few of them. So first of all, you have a number of professional societies that actually, whereas they might be focused on a certain discipline, not necessarily in terms of training and education outcomes, they do address those issues. And sometimes they're in special poster presentations or special symposia. If you're a member of that particular professional organization, then you can go and present your work within those forums. And examples of those are, we see it at American Chemical Society. We see it in the American Society for Cell Biology, ASCB. We see experimental biology, which is a series of societies that sort of come together to have their meetings, even though there are spaces there for individual societies. So one can then, based on your subdiscipline, present work in addition to what is there in terms of what happens in that basic science discipline as it relates to training and education. One can also look at conferences that are targeting diversity in science or impacts on the scientific workforce at various levels. There are some conferences that we should all be aware of that actually focus on our undergraduate and moving on many times our graduate populations. And there are three that I've listed here. There's the annual Biomedical Research Conference for Minoritized Students. Its name has changed recently a little bit. There's SACNAS, the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos and Native American Students. And ABR-CMS actually is, much of its support is from the NIH. SACNAS, I think, also is supported by the National Institutes of Health. ERN, the Emerging Researchers Network, has very strong support from the National Science Foundation. Actually, a lot of the programs, including LSAMP and HBCU Up and so forth, STEM, this would be the conference that a lot of those programs would then use as a venue because of its support, not only in terms of their programs by NSF, but also that particular meeting. Now, those meetings serve the purpose of having many times the students and trainees present their work there, but there are several opportunities there where one can go and disseminate work about the programs that you've run and the data that you've collected and the stories that you've developed as a result of those. Another segment is looking at conferences that are more focused, whereas the ones that I just mentioned, those are more student focused, but program directors and people who are running programs do present their work there. There are others that are much more focused in terms of what you've been doing at your institution. And sometimes this goes from pedagogy all the way to research training. And I've mentioned a few of these here. There is the Association of American Colleges and Universities has an annual STEM conference in the fall. That's a really great location because they do things from pedagogy. There are workshops where you can conduct all the way to presentations of your work. And these could be talks or these could be poster presentations. There is the American Society for Microbiology has the ASMQ conference, which again, similarly to the AAC&U STEM conference, focuses in these areas in education and training. And then there's the Council for Undergraduate Research. That's not so much discipline focused, but it focuses on undergraduate research. And there is where you not only can find a forum to present what you've done, but they also provide a really great environment for you to learn about funding and taking your work to the other level. I think most of these actually do that, but CURE actually does an exceptional job on that. And of course, there's the one that I'm personally biased about, which is the Understanding Interventions Conference. So Understanding Interventions, actually, that organization is part of SOSI, and it was developed with the purposeful objective of informing scholarship and practice reciprocally. And so Understanding Interventions conferences are designed particularly for the dissemination of this type of work, in addition to providing opportunities for training through our workshops and a variety of other mechanisms. There are posters, there are symposia talks, there are deeper dives where it's not only presenting, but allowing for a very deep discussion that might go into methodology and a variety of other areas. We can go to the next slide, please. So, in talking about dissemination, I'll spend the last couple of minutes of this section now talking about a couple of things. Shante Outlaw mentioned earlier about the UI index, and she talked about the index being this curated database of the literature relating to broadening participation. Well, it turns out that there are other segments within that resource that list, say, the journals that published this work. And you might see in the lower left-hand side of the slide, you'll see something that says journal list. So you can go in there and see the hundreds of journals that actually published this work, and you can go through and see this curated list that we have. Among those journals is the UI journal. And I'm just going to close this section by talking a little bit about how the UI journals model for operation is very different than many other journals. Many journals seek to get higher impacts by publishing a small percentage of the papers that are submitted to them. Actually, our objective is to do the opposite. We try to publish as many papers that are submitted to us as possible. And if papers are submitted that aren't necessarily ready to be published in terms of, the quality and how it conforms to what we want to do, or how we would like to present and disseminate this work, we actually have a mechanism by which we provide mentorship through the UI community to authors to bring their work to that level. We publish papers on various levels, letters, communications, and full works, representing different levels of development. And again, very supportive of the community. And again, there to reflect and take beyond what we do at our conferences and our workshops. So with that, I think I will pass it on beyond our work on dissemination.
And so at this point, we want to open the floor for questions. We have the Q&A function that is open, and would encourage you all to use the Q&A. I'm actually going to stop sharing the slides so that all of us as presenters will be on screen. And the Q&A will either be directed towards a specific presenter, depending on the question, or we'll just kind of have a popcorn kind of response. And so you can hear from the different perspectives about the questions posed. And I know that one question has already been put in the chat, and so I will read that question out for our presenters, and whomever wants to be the first person to respond, by all means. But the first question that we had received was, are there data resources that are less accessible to private institutions? If so, how do you advise going about gathering that data? So if you think about private institutions and any constraints or restrictions around data associated with them, are there resources that are less accessible? And if there are, how do we go about advising people from private institutions to thinking about data collection? I can get us started, and then I'll pass the mic. I think it depends on what kind of data you're trying to access. So I know that any institution, private or public, when it comes to student enrollment data, you have to work with their enrollment management office and their office for institutional research. And the structures of those offices can either be ones that support data collection, or the structures of those offices may become extenuating barriers to access that data. And I don't think that's a public versus private matter. I really think it's a institution by institution matter. And the concerns around student enrollment data, both in terms of ethics and the possible story that could be told from the student enrollment data. I would argue that any data that you want to collect would go through your institutional research board. So you should be able to still disseminate surveys, and you still should be able to disseminate interviews and focus groups and things, and collect artifacts. So we didn't really talk about artifacts, but if your program has students fill out some kind of worksheet or goal plan, or if they're accessing some kind of external resources like Career Navigator, there could be data associated with that you could pull and extract to include in your data collection. And I know that Shante had talked about those repositories. A lot of those repositories, from my experience, require communication with the holder of those repositories. And so that's not a private versus public matter. It's just what are the actual gatekeeping mechanisms for the keepers of that repository to access that data. And some of them require you to be in a private room and having security access because some of the data might be very sensitive. Others of it might be more freely accessible. And I'll stop there.
So I can talk a little bit about ICPSR, that's the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research. That this was mentioned in the list that Shante Outlaw had presented earlier. So access to that data is available to anyone who is affiliated with an institution that is a member of that consortium. And there are hundreds of domestic US institutions and international institutions that actually belong to the consortium. So Mike, I don't know if you are not affiliated with an institution that's not a member, how difficult it would be for your college or university to become a member. But the data are basically available for free. Anything that's in their archive is available to people. There are unrestricted and restricted data available. Restricted data is where there are some information in the data files where you could possibly identify a respondent or participant, but there's also the data that have been virtually de-identified and anonymized so that they give that kind of data to anyone who asks for it. There's also ways of analyzing the data online. There's I forget what it's called, but it's a thing you can do to statistically summarize data if you just wanted to see if the data were applicable to the way to the purpose you want to use it for.
Yeah, I mean, my only thing is that I actually had found the question a little bit puzzling because as what Terrell pointed out, I really don't think, from my knowledge, it's a matter of private or public, unless you're looking for data from a university system, and you're not part of that system, right? Which the larger systems tend to be public, but outside of something like that, it's not so much a matter of private or public, it's a matter of resources. But a lot of the, what Shante pointed out are freely accessible, and you might have to jump through a couple of hoops to be on the list to gain access, but there isn't a major cost associated with much of these.
I don't see another question yet. However, in having this conversation about accessing data and thinking about these hoops, a question I would pose to the panel that might be a question that's in the back of people's minds, though maybe not formulated, is in thinking about data and how you would use it either for your program benchmarks or to demonstrate impact or for research. What are some of those institutional hoops? Do you need IRB for all of your data? Or is there ways that you can draw data that doesn't require IRB and that you can then speak to certain audiences without it? So yeah, the question is around like some of those barriers and hoops and which ones are needed for what kinds of data and for what kinds of dissemination.
So I'm currently trying to collect data from institutions other than my own. And one of the hoops is FERPA. So I'm trying to get sort of not a random sample, a sample of students majoring in STEM. But the institutions, these are not the ones where I'm affiliated, but other institutions are unable to give the data directly to me because of FERPA considerations. Other institutions are willing to provide it, but they will only provide the data where students have agreed to have their information, their contact information shared with persons outside of their own institution.
Absolutely. I've also had difficulty, not only in terms of what can be shared, but sometimes even with the level of understanding or how the rules are interpreted by individuals at certain institutions, especially if you are, in my case, we evaluate programs and sometimes collaborate with institutional researchers. And we have seen situations where requirements are made for IRB, but sort of set things in a way that it's almost impossible for an outside person to do the collaboration. There was an example where we had to get IRB permission to gain access to data to look at a program. However, there were rules against one being included with permission if you're from outside the institution through the IRB process. So it sort of puts you in a strange place where you just can't do the work, and we had to back out of the project. We have collaborated with other institutions where it hasn't been a problem. So sometimes having knowledge of the rules to, in very diplomatic ways, educate your colleagues if they don't have a full understanding. We've also seen situations where by certain funders, in terms of their policy for work that they fund, exemptions made if the work is education and research related, as opposed to, direct research questions, if it's associated with the program as part of education research. And IRB exemption doesn't necessarily mean that you don't need it. It just means that it's an affirmative kind of exemption. You want the IRB to determine that it's not, that's not needed, that's exempt. Again, misunderstanding as to the process and so forth can be a barrier. However, one can use that opportunity, especially if it's at an institution or with a department that hasn't done a lot of this type of work. One can have the information to help to enlighten our colleagues to remove some of those barriers.
I also think one thing to think about, particularly in requesting data and all of that, that may be not necessarily a barrier, but something to definitely keep in mind is when asking, kind of really be clear and explicit is what the data is being used for. And how it's being disseminated, I think is really, really important. So as you're thinking about that, and that gives you a clear picture then of what type of data that you really want to collect. So I think that's one thing to definitely keep in mind as you're, thinking about the different data sources and types of data that you want when asking and kind of making those connections. What is it being used for, and how is it being disseminated as well?
That reminds me of one more thing, Natasha, that kind of came up in our conversation. And I think Terrell really described it well. Within our SOSI group, we have a wide range of individuals, right, that come to this from different places. We have social science people. We have social science people who are operating, within administrative structures. We have basic science people who are coming to the social sciences and, coming as evaluators or trying to, do social science research. And in doing this, there are certain things that we're sort of trained in terms of approaches when we look at questions. Mm-hmm. And when you did the case study, the way that conversation went is that, you do something, you look at it, you might have collected some data, and then one can say, okay, fine, what's the story that's in here? Another way to approach it is when you go in, especially if one doesn't have a lot of experience and expertise in this space, it probably is helpful to bring someone in to see what the questions could be. And that might inform the type of data that you want to collect, because sometimes once you've gone down the road a couple of years, you probably can't go back and collect some data that could be helpful to you. So it would be good to get a social scientist who understands this from the research perspective, or an evaluator at the very beginning when you're coming up with the ideas to make sure that your objectives are measurable, and to make sure, especially if it's NSF, where they're asking for a research type question within this, that you're asking a question, if it goes beyond the bounds of what you're collecting for the evaluation of the program, you have access to those data if it's at the institution or a wider range. So that's something I recommend thinking about. But there's nothing wrong, though, with the whole idea that I've learned from my social science colleagues, that sometimes you can come in and look at what's there and then make determinations as to what you can pull together, supplemented by some later data collection. But it's not too late to make the story if one hadn't done it purposefully from the beginning.
Yeah, I'd like to reinforce that point, Tony, because I think that many institutional research offices will provide the code book or the list of variables that can be accessed, and they will inform you which variables you probably cannot request. Let's put it that for various reasons. But above that, I wanted to mention the fact that some institutions require persons from outside to sign a data use agreement. And you have to, in those agreements, you have to state exactly the reason why you want to access data, and specifically what sort of data you want to, I guess, obtain from the institution. And it is a legal document, just so that people are aware of that.
Absolutely.
I appreciate that. Yeah. So a couple of points that I would add before I pass the buck to Michael Garcia, our program director, is that you can collect data for program impact reasons and then go back and use that data for research reasons. And so I know that sometimes people think data can only be used for one story or not, but that's not true. Of course, you still have to make sure you follow proper protocols and procedures, because if you collected data for like program impact reasons and you did not do an IRB, if you wanted to do the more scholastic dissemination, you would have to go back and collect an IRB and do what will be called a secondary data analysis. And we'll get more into data analysis as a part of these Lunch and Learn series. We're just kind of stepwising it or scaffolding conversations around the dissemination process by starting with this idea of data. And so at this particular point, if there are no other remarks from our panelists, I will pass it on to Dr. Garcia to close us out. But just wanted to see really quick if there was any other last minute thoughts that people would like to share around data collection, opportunities for data. All right. Dr. Garcia, the floor is yours.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. It says the host has spotlighted. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you all, our attendees, our panelists, for your time today and for joining us and being a part of our inaugural scaffold of our Lunch and Learn series. I'd like to point out that we do have more coming up. So save the date, our webinar 2, Integrating Theory and Data, and Friday, February 24th, 2023. And thinking through theory and data collection, analysis, and dissemination. So ultimately with the goal of getting us writing some of the results we're obtaining from some of our programs. More importantly, we have, or equally importantly, we have the SOSI Summer Institute coming up. Tentative date is the end of June 2023. Our last one was in person, and we're talking about having this one coming up in 2023 in person as well. So please be on the lookout for information on the SOSI website. It will have a kind of culmination in our writing workshop and workshops leveraging critical strength-based frameworks to design, implement, and disseminate outcomes for STEM broadening participation programs. Again, all this will be available on our website. For more information, it is right here, diversity.missouri.edu/program/LSRCE-SOSI. Or if you would like more direct communication, please feel free to email me, Michael Garcia at garciaml@missouri.edu. We certainly appreciate you attending. You're being part of our inaugural Lunch and Learn. And we certainly hope to see you at some of the future ones and at our Summer Institute, and if it's in person or virtual. Thank you so much for all your time today. Thank you for making time in your busy schedules to spend some time with us.